Well, let's now turn to some major developments on the future of African trade with the United States. Now, the U.S. House of Representatives has approved a 3-year extension to a deal which has proved hugely popular across the continent over the past quarter century. Now, it was first enacted in 2000. The so-called African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, provides many sub-Saharan African nations with tariff-free access to the U.S. market for thousands of products. Now, after a year of deep uncertainty with U.S. tariffs and, of course, Trump's America First policy, the agreement expired in October, raising deep concerns amongst exporters and policymakers in Africa. Now, in recent months, there was a lot of speculation that Washington was happy to renew it, and the House has now confirmed exactly that, with about 340 lawmakers now voting in favor and only 54 against it. Well, that's not the end of it, though. The bill now heads to the U.S. Senate, where debates over geopolitics and foreign policy are expected to shape its final outcome. Now, as that list of countries benefiting from AGOA is determined by the White House going forward, whether South Africa is included in this new deal remains uncertain. The government of Africa's most industrialized economy has been under increasing scrutiny in Washington over its policies. It has, however, welcomed the latest approval by the U.S. House of Representatives. Reacting to the move, the country's trade minister said that AGOA's 3-year extension would, in quotes, provide certainty and predictability for African and American businesses that, of course, rely on the program. Well, let's discuss all of this further with international trade specialist Sizwe Gcayi. Great to have you on the show with us, sir. And I'd like to start off with asking you, is this extension consequential? Is it even necessary, given the fact that Trump's April reciprocal tariffs basically override the tariff-free provisions that were under AGOA? What's your take on that?
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me. I think the starting point, really, when one looks at the recent announcement that the U.S. Congress has passed AGOA with the majority vote on a bipartisan basis. We were quite pleasantly surprised, in view of the policy approach that the Trump administration adopted. At this juncture, it's hard to say whether it is consequential because of the process that the legislation still has to go through to the Senate, as well as finally it must serve before the president. You will recall that, as you correctly pointed out, that the trade relations were disturbed by the so-called liberation tariffs, which basically since April, AGOA, trade under AGOA was effectively suspended. Now, a lot of arrangements have been happening through exemptions for different products that the U.S. deems essential. So at this stage, one cannot really say much about the bill that has been passed by Congress.
Well, here's another fact to consider. We know the deal expired about 3 months ago, September 30th, I believe. What kind of impact has the uncertainty around its renewal had on any supply chains? Have we seen any disruptions there? Also, what impact has it had on investor confidence and overall trade relations between Africa and the U.S.?
I mean, one cannot talk about fundamental disruptions because if you look at the major products in the form of key raw materials that the U.S. sources from different African markets, there were always exemptions in place for your critical minerals, for like your platinum group metals and the like. So from that perspective, one will say that we did not see any major disruptions. Now, when it comes to manufactured products, for example, like if you look at our automotive sector in South Africa, there was quite a bit of time. There's a lead time between the orders that are placed for export to the US and the time that the products are eventually exported to the US. So there was an anticipation in that regard. So by and large, a lot of manufacturers at that time were not shipping out products since the beginning of the year due to when the Trump administration came into office. By and large, in terms of the core US Africa trade, there's not been major disruptions, again, due to the various exemptions that the Trump administration has been applying.
And that's interesting that you also bring up the automotive sector in South Africa, because while the U.S. House of Reps overwhelmingly approved of an extension, there's still some uncertainty about South Africa's inclusion in this deal going forward, especially in light of those current tensions with the Trump administrations. What are your thoughts on how we'll see South Africa feature in this deal?
I mean, if you think about South Africa's position, you have to go back to the first Trump administration. Before South Africa was included, there were negotiations that centered around the poultry industry, in terms of access for US chicken, access for US beef and pork products. So there were technical negotiations on the side, even at that time. So this is not something that is new to South Africa in terms of dealing with the Trump administration, whereby we have to experience a unique pressure from different lobby groups in the US that will seek different concessions. But with the current administration now, the pressure has really been increased, if one may say, because we've never been in the spotlight in this way. Before, the negotiations were quite direct on specific issues. There are negotiations underway between the US and South Africa, which are seeking to ensure that South Africa is included in an extended AGOA. But those negotiations, the way that the announcements we've seen locally is that they are under a very strict confidentiality regime at the insistence of the US, something that we've never seen in South Africa before. And one must point out that to the extent that the negotiations are going to seek policy concessions in South Africa that have legislative implications, we may not see the end of it anytime soon. One should look at perhaps to say that at the end of the day, it is much in the interest of the US to include South Africa in an extended AGOA, mainly because of the strategic nature of South Africa's position in the African market. If you think about it, if you exclude South African exports under AGOA, you will pretty much be left with no manufactured products that are exported to the US under AGOA. They will be very minimum. For the legitimacy of the AGOA program for US policy interests, they pretty much need South Africa as much as we need AGOA in the long run. But I must say that it is quite tricky to negotiate with the current administration. It was before the issues were very straightforward. The technical issues were straightforward in terms of addressing. But now what we see is the Trump administration seeking policy concessions from the South African government, something that we've never been confronted with. And if you had any chance to observe our domestic news over the weekend, it was the birthday of the ANC, and the president of the ANC, who happens to be the president of the country, made a clear pronouncement that South Africa is not prepared to be bullied, especially when it comes to policy issues that are fundamental to our constitutional architecture in terms of the direction of the country. So one can expect very tough negotiations going forward. Yeah.
That's quite interesting. And of course, like you mentioned, this administration, Trump's administration, is a little different from what South Africa is used to dealing with, and Africa as a whole. But of course, the bill is now heading to the US Senate. As we mentioned earlier, we could see debates over geopolitics, foreign policy, shaping its final outcome. What are your expectations?
And if you look at the number of senators when it comes to geopolitical issues, you one is expecting a very difficult negotiating terrain. Having said that, I mean, you look at for example, the pronouncements made, they center around neutralizing China, neutralizing Russia as influence in the African continent. Now, if you look at most African countries and our foreign policy posture, it is not about whether we are for this side or that side. It is about pursuing our interests. It is quite unfortunate that you still have, at this day and age, senators who look at the world in terms of people being divided, countries being divided along alliances. Because what all countries will be focused on now, with what humanity has gone through, it's a shared future that we should all be benefiting on a win-win basis. The idea that people in America should determine who our friends are and who our enemies should be is something that African countries have no appetite to get involved in. I mean, one of the political parties, for example, earlier on today in South Africa, rejected the extension of AGOA purely on the basis that part of the announcements made seek exactly that, to influence African countries not to deal with China, not to deal or to restrict dealings with China, Russia, and the other strategic opponents or enemies of the US, as they like to call it. So to the extent that the negotiations are going to take that path of dictating to African countries who our friends and enemies should be, it may very well be that the US may come out as the biggest loser in all of this. But if they take a win-win approach and they recognize the sovereignty of African countries, perhaps we'll be able to begin to chart a different path.